With Bill 96 being passed into law, we thought it'd be important to clarify just what exactly the term historic anglophone means. Now, the term was first evoked by Bill 96 architect himself, Simon Jolin Barrette, in November of 2019. And it's been criticized as, quote, an old, backward kind of framing. Our next guest wrote an explainer for the Gazette on exactly what it means, and he's here to break it down for us. René Bruemmer, journalist who writes for the Gazette. René, welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks very much.
So, Stephen Hawking, 1988, writes a book, very, very successful book, one of the greatest books of all time, A Brief History of Time. And as I read your story in the Gazette, I wanted to call it A Brief History of the Historic Anglophone. Give us the brief history, René, of historic anglophones.
So that's it. As you said, it's come up a lot and become much more important all of a sudden. And it's funny. So it appears that the first time the idea sort of came out or started to be spelled out was this press conference in 2019 held by Simon Jolin Barrette. And it's funny, I happened to be at that press conference, and I remembered it was kind of a hasty affair. I think I was in the office working on something else, and I said, "Oh, Monsieur Jolin Barrette has this. We should probably go check it out." And it was in a small office in downtown Montreal, and sort of quick. But that's when he came out with this notice that going forward, the government planned to sort of restrict access to certain services in English, and says, we wanted, in a way of promoting the French language, we were going to limit, who can get these services, and that could be anything from your hydro bill, for instance, instead of you might have gotten it in English before, well, now you're going to get it in French, perhaps, or even information numbers on the phone or things like that, and so then we asked, well, who will get this? And he said, he referred to it as the historic English community. And I remember there's a lot of confusion at the press conference. There's only 2 or 3 Anglo reporters there. And so we tried to nail down what that meant. And he was not clear. In fact, I remember following him all the way to the elevator to try and get confirmation. And still it wasn't clear, how do you determine who this is? A little bit later, perhaps in the next few weeks, because this question came up a lot, Monsieur Legault sort of said, well, perhaps it's people who are educated in English, or if your parents were educated in English, but did not really clarify. And but then, of course, it became a big thing, and your colleague Aaron Wren at CJAD had these
the T-shirts.
The T-shirts, of course, the historic Quebec Anglo T-shirts that came up and garnered a lot of attention and raised a lot of money for charity, so that was good. But then it sort of, the idea kind of festered for a while, or sort of simmered off until Bill 96 came up, and then we slowly started to get the idea that this idea was coming back into play again in terms of which members of Quebec community would be allowed to get certain services in English going forward.
We're with René Bruemmer, journalist, writes for the Gazette, recently penned a piece that takes a look at the brief history of the term historic anglophone. So René, it's a qualifier, it's just one word, historic, but boy, does it ever have a lot of weight when it comes to limiting the anglophone population. Let's dive more into that aspect.
Yeah, so that's it. So it's been kind of interesting. It's been sort of a vague notion, right? Who gets services in English in the past, and because it's sort of hard to determine, well, what makes an English speaker exactly, and so what it seemed to have been, or for what we've seen is, when they were working out the Quebec Health and Social Services Act in '86 and making amendments, and so this came up. Of course, it's okay, who's legally able to get these services in English. And at the time, there was sort of an effort, I believe, by the Parti Québécois to narrow the definition. And the health minister at the time said, whoa, we're not in language legislation here. We're in giving access to health care. And it has to be given, in a proper way so that people can understand it, because, of course, communication is primordial. And so she said at the time, basically, we will call it anybody who's more comfortable getting it in English than in French, right? And this seems to pertain to roughly 1.1 million Quebecers who sort of identify in this way and say, French is not my first language, and if I need to get something crucial, I'm more comfortable getting it in English because I understand that. So, okay, fine, we sort of stayed with that. So now what has changed, and in Bill 101, it does say who's eligible for English education. It only pertains to that. And that, as we know, is if you or your parents were educated in English in Quebec or elsewhere in Canada, then you're eligible to continue in English education here. So it just pertains to that. What's happened with Bill 96, which is amending the French Language Charter, Bill 101, is that they've sort of said for all services, or many services now, whether or not you get it in English or French depends on whether you are eligible for English education in Quebec. And so advocates are saying that the big difference now is that it puts certain restrictions on who can get English services in the province, and perhaps as many as 500,000 English-speaking Quebecers would no longer be eligible under the new provisions.
Well, René, that was the eye-opening part when I'm reading your piece, when I saw that number. This is what it comes down to. For the Quebec government, this is about, is this a 9.7% or is it a 14% of our population are anglophones, and their intention to always go towards the smaller number there? That's a big thing, right? We're talking about 500,000 people and the way they live their lives in this province.
Well, that's it. And depending on the services that you're getting too, I mean, if it's one thing with your hydro bill, but it's another thing as to, what language that your health professional, for instance, has to speak to you in. That's quite another thing. And a lot of the annoyance or frustration or worry, basically, I think worry is the best word, is that it doesn't seem clear under the Bill 96 amendments that who is exactly eligible, or for instance, under healthcare. They say it's like, no, the government's saying, it's still guaranteed under the Health and Services Act. We put in an amendment to that fact. But the thing is that even the Health and Social Services Act says that you're guaranteed, say, English services where that institution is capable of giving them, right? Mm-hmm. But if that institution doesn't have any English speakers in it, it's like, well, you're out of luck. And so whereas previously it would be, perhaps that there would be people in place to give you those services. Now that's much less clear. It's also unclear too, because it sort of says in Bill 96, part of the amendments is that it could be in the case of just a health emergency. So, if you're dying or you're having a heart attack, there has to be somebody on hand who's going to contact you. But if you want to know how to take your medication properly or speak to your doctor, well, that's not necessarily guaranteed, which is why a lot of advocates are saying, look, why don't we just, exclude health and social services? And of course, social services also, with psychologists, it's youth services. There's a lot of different things that come into play there.
And the ceremony for Bill 96 tomorrow with the Lieutenant Governor, in fact. René, listen, thank you so much for coming on our program. For those that want to read more about the brief history of the term historic Anglophone, I've just retweeted René's tweet. So if you go to my Twitter, @EliasMakos, you'll find René's account. He's a good follow on Twitter as well. René, thanks for coming by.
Good. Thanks so much for having me.
René Bruemmer, journalist, writes for the Gazette.